The fluorescent lights in the private dining room of Aurelia hummed with that particular frequency of dying bulbs. A high-pitched whine that made your teeth ache and your nerves fray. The sound seemed to bounce off the mahogany walls and crystal chandelier, creating an atmosphere thick enough to cut with the sterling silver knives laid precisely on the white linen tablecloth. Chloe Martinez pressed her palm against the cold marble of the service counter, feeling the veins of gold running through the stone like frozen lightning. She wondered if anyone else knew these counters cost more than most people made in a year. The Hermès perfume from the woman who'd just passed. Jour d'Hermès, $260 a bottle, she knew because she'd cleaned up a broken one last week. Couldn't quite mask the sharp tang of anxiety sweat that permeated the air. In the center of the opulent room, 4 figures sat around an expansive table that could have seated 12. The space between them felt like a chasm filled with tension so thick it was almost visible. On one side sat Richard Sterling and Marcus Thorne, 2 men whose very posture screamed entitlement and barely contained impatience. Across from them, Alara Vance sat with the rigid composure of carved marble, her translator David Chen positioned slightly behind her like a guardian. Richard Sterling, CEO of Sterling Innovations, was a man in his late 50s whose silver hair looked meticulously sculpted even at this late hour. His blue eyes held the calculating coldness of someone who'd spent decades turning human dreams into profit margins. Every gesture, from the way he adjusted his Patek Philippe watch to how he held his wine glass, was performed with the unconscious arrogance of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. Beside him, Marcus Thorne cut a sharper figure. Younger, sleeker, hungrier. His Tom Ford suit probably cost more than Chloe's annual tuition, and he wore it like armor. His smile was too wide, his teeth too perfect, and his eyes held that peculiar predatory gleam that came from viewing every human interaction as a transaction to be won. But it was Alara Vance who commanded Chloe's attention. The older Japanese woman sat with her spine perfectly straight, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant knot that spoke of discipline and control. She wore a simple dark silk dress, unadorned except for a jade ring that caught the light when she moved her hands. Her face was a masterpiece of composure, revealing nothing while seeing everything. Chloe had been moving through this scene for over an hour now, refilling water glasses and clearing plates with the practiced invisibility her job demanded. She'd learned to read rooms the way meteorologists read storm systems, the slight tension in shoulders that preceded an argument, the forced laughter that masked desperation, the way powerful people's voices changed when they thought no one important was listening. Tonight felt different. The air crackled with something dangerous, like the moments before lightning strikes. The conversation, if it could be called that, had been a study in frustration. Richard would launch into elaborate corporate flattery, his voice booming across the table like he was addressing a stadium. David would lean in, whisper a condensed version to Alara in Japanese, and she would respond with a quiet phrase that he'd translate back into corporate speak. It was like watching tennis played through a brick wall. "Ms. Vance, your revolutionary work in neural interfacing," Richard was saying, his hands gesturing expansively. "Combined with our global distribution network, we could literally change the world. The synergies are unprecedented," David murmured to Alara in Japanese. She responded with what sounded like a single sentence. David turned back to the Americans. "Ms. Vance appreciates your vision and sees the potential benefits of partnership. But Chloe, who'd grown up in Kyoto, where her father served as a cultural attaché, understood every word Alara had actually said. These men speak as if the world exists only to be conquered, not understood. The disconnect between what was said and what was translated was growing wider with each exchange. David's translations were technically accurate but stripped of all nuance, all the subtle layers of meaning that made Japanese such a precise instrument for conveying respect, doubt, or polite dismissal. Marcus was losing patience. He leaned toward Richard, cupping his hand in what he probably thought was subtle. "What is this, Richard? Some kind of power play? She's making us beg through him for everything." Richard's smile tightened like a wire under tension. "Stay calm, Marcus. This is cultural. It's about hierarchy, respect. We play the game, we get the prize. 500 million is worth a little theater." Chloe nearly dropped the crystal water pitcher she was holding. $500 million. The number hit her like a physical blow. She'd been serving tables for 3 years to pay her way through art school, calculating tips in dollars, while they discussed deals in hundreds of millions. She watched Alara's face as the two men whispered, noting how the older woman's eyes tracked their every movement, despite her apparent inability to understand their English. There was something unsettling about that gaze, too sharp, too aware for someone who was supposedly lost in translation. "She asks about your recent vacation to the Cayman Islands, Mr. Sterling," David translated after Alara spoke a soft question. Richard blinked, caught off guard. "Oh yes, very relaxing. How did she?" "She also notes that your company's stock dropped 2 points this afternoon after the quarterly projections leaked." David continued relaying another of Alara's observations. Marcus's face paled slightly. They were being dissected with surgical precision by a woman who supposedly couldn't understand them, her questions delivered like scalpel cuts through their composure. The frustration in the room was becoming toxic. These were men accustomed to dominating every conversation, to having their words hang in the air like commandments. Being reduced to playing telephone through a translator was clearly eating at them. Chloe moved closer to clear the appetizer plates, her trained invisibility allowing her to hover at the edge of their conversation. That's when she heard Marcus try a new tactic, his voice rising as he spoke slowly and loudly as if volume could bridge the language gap. "We are offering you very good money," he said, holding up his fingers like he was addressing a child. "Lots of money." The insult was so profound, so deeply ignorant, that Chloe felt a phantom sting of shame on his behalf. She saw Alara's eyes flicker with something that looked like pain. Not anger, but a deep, weary sadness that spoke of a lifetime of such encounters. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his professional composure. "Ms. Vance understands your financial offer," he translated, though what Alara had actually said was far more cutting. "Please tell this child that the buzzing of a fly disrupts my thoughts less than his shouting." The evening was spiraling toward disaster, and these men were too blinded by their own arrogance to see it. They were about to lose a $500 million deal through sheer cultural incompetence and casual racism. And the woman across from them was letting them hang themselves with their own words. Chloe retreated to the service area, her mind reeling. She'd witnessed corporate meetings before, had served enough power lunches to recognize the rhythms of high-stakes negotiations. But this felt different. This felt like watching a slow-motion catastrophe with Alara Vance as both victim and orchestrator of whatever was about to unfold. Her manager had drilled into her the cardinal rule of service at Aurelia. "You are invisible. You do not exist. You see nothing, hear nothing, and speak nothing unless directly addressed by a guest." But as she watched Richard and Marcus lean in for another whispered conference, their voices carrying just enough for her to catch fragments about cutting out performance incentives and "she'll never know the difference," Chloe realized she was about to witness something far worse than cultural insensitivity. She was about to watch them commit fraud. The private dining room had transformed into a theater of deception. Richard Sterling pulled a leather portfolio from his briefcase, the sound of expensive hardware clicking against the mahogany table like the cocking of a weapon. His movements were deliberate, calculated, the gestures of a man who'd perfected the art of making theft look like charity. "This is our revised offer," Richard announced, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. The document landed with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the crystalline silence. "We've streamlined everything, made it much more straightforward. It's designed for your peace of mind, Alara. He was using her first name now, the false intimacy sliding off his tongue like oil on water. Chloe felt her stomach clench as she watched him lean back in his chair, radiating the confidence of a predator that had cornered its prey. Marcus picked up the thread seamlessly. Exactly. We're taking all the complicated operational headaches off your shoulders. You can focus on your recovery while we handle the technical details. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. It's really a turnkey solution. David Chen reached for the document, but Richard's hand intercepted it, sliding it directly toward Alara. I think Ms. Vance should review this personally. After all, it's her decision. The manipulation was surgical in its precision. They were counting on her language barrier to hide the poison in the contract's fine print. Chloe watched as Alara's fingers touched the leather binding, her expression unreadable. The older woman began to flip through the pages slowly, methodically, her dark eyes scanning the dense legal text. What Richard and Marcus didn't notice, but Chloe did, was how Alara's finger movements weren't random. She was reading with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. Her supposed language disability clearly didn't extend to written English. Section 12 is just standard redundancy protocols, Marcus said casually, his voice carrying the practiced dismissiveness of someone used just to glossing over inconvenient details. Really just corporate housekeeping. And Clause 7B, Richard added. That's boilerplate indemnification language, every deal has it. But as Chloe moved closer to refill water glasses, she caught sight of the actual text over Alara's shoulder. Clause 7B wasn't standard anything. It was a unilateral power grab that would give Sterling Innovations the right to renegotiate all existing intellectual property licenses. Section 12 wasn't about redundancy. It was a non-compete clause so broadly written it would effectively prevent Alara from working in technology for a decade. They weren't acquiring her company. They were buying her silence and stealing her life's work. Alara continued reading, her face a mask of serene concentration. Occasionally she would point to a specific clause and murmur something in Japanese to David, who would nod and make notes. The Americans watched this exchange with barely concealed impatience. What's the holdup? Marcus muttered, his veneer of politeness beginning to crack. Just tell her it's standard language. That's when Chloe heard Alara speak for the first time directly to the room, her voice barely above a whisper. The Japanese words were soft, almost musical, but there was something in her tone that made Chloe's chest tighten with recognition. Koko ni watashi wo miru hito wa imasen ka? Alara set her eyes, not looking at David or the Americans, but somehow seeming to address the air itself. Is there no one here who sees me? The question hung in the perfumed air like a prayer or a challenge. Chloe felt her breath catch in her throat. She understood not just the words, but the profound loneliness embedded in them. This brilliant woman, surrounded by people who viewed her as either an obstacle or an asset, was asking if anyone in the room saw her as human. Richard was growing visibly agitated. Look, this is taking too long. We've got other meetings. Just explain to her that time is money. She's obviously having trouble with the complexity. Marcus added, his voice dripping with condescension. Maybe we should simplify this even further. Chloe watched as they began discussing their next move openly. As if Alara were a piece of furniture. Their whispered conversation grew bolder, more explicit about their intentions to exploit what they saw as her vulnerability. The R&D division valuation, Richard murmured to Marcus. We buried it in the general assets category. She'll never spot it. Brilliant, Marcus replied, his eyes gleaming. That's another 50 million we can absorb without her knowing. Alara continued reading, her finger tracing lines of text with scholarly precision. But Chloe noticed something else. The older woman's breathing had changed. It was shallow now, controlled like someone trying to contain a building storm. David Chen shifted uncomfortably in his seat. As the official translator, he was trapped between his professional obligations and what was becoming an increasingly obvious ethical nightmare. His usual composure was cracking, revealing a man caught between loyalty to his employer and complicity in her potential destruction. The room's atmosphere had become suffocating. The crystal chandelier cast prismatic shadows that danced across the white tablecloth like ghosts of better intentions. The scent of expensive food had turned cloying, mixing with the metallic taste of greed that seemed to permeate the air. Chloe retreated to the service station, her hands shaking as she arranged silverware that didn't need arranging. She'd grown up watching her diplomat father navigate cultural misunderstandings and language barriers with patience and respect. What she was witnessing here was the opposite, a systematic exploitation of someone's perceived weakness. The cardinal rule of service at Aurelia echoed in her mind. You are invisible. You do not exist. But invisibility, she was beginning to realize, came with its own power. She could see everything while being seen by no one. She could understand what was really being said while everyone assumed she was just another piece of background decoration. Her phone buzzed softly in her apron pocket. A text from her roommate asking about rent money. Another from her mother checking if she was eating enough. Simple human concerns from a world that felt increasingly distant from this golden cage of corporate predation. As she looked back at the table, Chloe saw Richard lean forward with renewed confidence. He'd apparently decided that patience was no longer profitable. "Elara," he said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a funeral director. "I understand this is overwhelming. Brain injuries can affect comprehension in so many ways. But that's exactly why you need partners you can trust to handle these complex details." The medical condescension was breathtaking in its cruelty. They weren't just stealing from her, they were using her vulnerability as justification for the theft. Alara's head lifted slowly from the contract. Her eyes, when they met Richard's, held a depth that seemed to pierce straight through his practiced smile. For a moment, the mask of confusion slipped, revealing something far more dangerous underneath. The sharp analytical intelligence that had built a technological empire from nothing. But the moment passed so quickly that Richard and Marcus missed it entirely. They saw only what they expected to see, a confused, isolated woman ripe for exploitation. "David," Richard said, turning to the translator. "Please explain to Ms. Vance that we're trying to help her. This simplified structure protects her from having to worry about operational complexities." David's translation came out mechanical, drained of emotion. But Chloe could see the shame in his shoulders, the way his usually perfect posture had begun to collapse under the weight of what he was being asked to facilitate. Elara listened to the translation, then spoke a single sentence in Japanese. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in its cadence that made the entire room seem to hold its breath. David hesitated before translating. "Ms. Vance, she says she understands your concern for her well-being." But what Elara had actually said was far more pointed. "Even a child can recognize a wolf no matter how carefully it dresses in sheep's clothing." The game was entering its final phase, and Chloe realized she was the only one who could see all the pieces on the board. The moment of reckoning arrived with the soft whisper of paper being set aside. Elara Vance placed the contract on the table with the deliberate precision of a chess master positioning the final piece. Her movements were unhurried, almost ceremonial, as if she were performing a ritual that had been planned long before any of them had entered this room. Richard and Marcus leaned forward like vultures, sensing carrion, their earlier impatience replaced by predatory anticipation. They'd convinced themselves that her careful review was the behavior of someone overwhelmed by complexity, not someone cataloging their deceptions with forensic precision. "Have you had a chance to review everything?" Richard asked, his voice thick with false concern. "I know it's a lot to process, especially given your circumstances." The word circumstances hung in the air like a blade sharp with implication. He was using her injury as a weapon, turning her vulnerability into justification for his theft. David Chen began to translate, but Elara held up a slight hand, stopping him mid-sentence. For the first time all evening, she looked directly at Richard Sterling. her dark eyes holding his pale blue ones with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. When she spoke, her Japanese was different from before. Gone was the soft, formal tone she'd maintained throughout dinner. This was the voice of command, crisp and authoritative, carrying the weight of 4 decades in boardrooms where she'd been the only woman, the only foreigner. The only one who'd had to prove herself worthy of breathing the same air as the men around her. Chloe felt her heart hammer against her ribs as she understood every word. Elara wasn't asking questions anymore. She was delivering verdicts. David-san. Elara set her gaze, never leaving Richard's face. Please tell Mr. Sterling and Mr. Thorne that their performance this evening has been illuminating. David's translation was careful, professional, but it couldn't capture the surgical precision of her tone. Richard smiled, taking her words as encouragement. I'm so glad we could find common ground, he said, reaching for his Mont Blanc pen like a weapon being drawn from its sheath. Shall we sign the letter of intent tonight? Get this wonderful partnership started. But Elara wasn't finished. She continued speaking in Japanese, her words flowing like water over stone, wearing away pretense with each syllable. Chloe listened in growing amazement as the older woman began to dismantle the evening's charade with the methodical efficiency of a master surgeon. Please inform them. David translated, his voice growing stronger as he began to understand his employer's strategy. That Ms. Vance has some questions about specific clauses. Richard's smile tightened. Of course, happy to clarify anything. Elara's finger moved to Section 12 of the contract, the non-compete clause they'd dismissed as routine paperwork. When she spoke, her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd spent her career reading between the lines of documents designed to exploit her. She's asking, David translated, why a standard redundancy clause requires her personal non-compete for 10 years in any technology-related field. Marcus blinked rapidly, the smooth confidence draining from his face like air from a punctured balloon. It's just protective language. Industry standard. Elara's response came swift and cutting. David's translation was precise. She notes that industry standard non-competes rarely exceed 2 years and never include research conducted prior to the acquisition. The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard's hand had stopped moving toward his pen, frozen halfway across the table like a predator suddenly realizing it had wandered into a trap. But Elara wasn't finished with her dissection. Her finger moved to Clause 7B, the intellectual property grab they'd buried in legal jargon. When she spoke this time, there was something almost playful in her tone. The satisfaction of a hunter who'd been tracking prey all evening and was finally ready to spring the snare. She's curious. David translated, his own voice gaining confidence as he realized he was no longer facilitating fraud but exposing it. About the unilateral renegotiation rights for existing IP licenses. She wonders if you're aware that this would allow you to sell her patents to competitors immediately after closing. Marcus's face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the room's controlled climate. That's not... We would never... Elara's next words cut through his stammering like a blade through silk. David's translation was knife-sharp. She also notes with interest that the R&D division, valued at $100 million in the initial proposal, seems to have vanished entirely from this document. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of a $500 million deal disintegrating in real time, the death rattle of carefully constructed deceptions being exposed to light. Richard Sterling, for all his arrogance and calculated cruelty, was not a stupid man. He could see the writing on the wall as clearly as if it were painted in blood. His earlier confidence cracked like ice under pressure, revealing the desperate calculation underneath. Now hold on, he said, his voice rising slightly. I think there might be some confusion here. These are complex documents, and given your situation, perhaps we should have our legal teams review everything more carefully. He was trying to gaslight her to use her injury as a shield for his fraud. The audacity was breathtaking even by the standards Chloe had observed in this room of predators. But Ilara Vance had been preparing for this moment all evening. Every polite nod, every apparent moment of confusion, every time she'd let them think they were superior. It had all been building to this crescendo. She reached into her small purse and withdrew a device that looked innocuous enough. A slim silver rectangle no larger than a smartphone. But when she placed it on the table and pressed a single button, Richard and Marcus both recoiled as if she'd placed a cobra between them. The sound that emerged was tinny but unmistakable, their own voices recorded with crystal clarity. "We'll cut out the performance incentives for her executive team. She'll never know the difference. She's lost in her own world." The recording played their entire whispered conspiracy, every greedy word, every dismissive comment, every moment they'd thought themselves safe in their arrogance. Their voices filled the elegant dining room like accusations from the grave. When the recording ended, the silence was absolute. Richard Sterling looked as if he'd aged a decade in the span of 30 seconds. Marcus Thorne was staring at the device as if it might spontaneously combust and take his career with it. And then in the profound quiet that followed the destruction of their schemes, Ilara Vance performed her final miracle. She looked across the table at the two men who'd tried to rob her blind, leaned forward slightly, and spoke her first English words of the evening. Her voice was quiet, slightly raspy from disuse, but perfectly chillingly clear. "Gentlemen, I believe this negotiation is concluded." The shock was seismic. It wasn't just that she could speak English. It was that she'd chosen this moment, this perfect, devastating moment, to reveal that every assumption they'd made about her had been catastrophically wrong. Chloe watched from her position by the service door as the two most powerful men in the room crumbled like sandcastles before an incoming tide. The woman they'd dismissed as a confused invalid was revealed as a master strategist who'd orchestrated their downfall with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. The game was over and they had lost everything. The aftermath of revelation hit the room like a shockwave, leaving everything displaced and trembling. Richard Sterling sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through expressions of shock, rage, and dawning horror, as the full implications of what had just occurred began to sink in. Marcus Thorne looked like a man who'd just watched his entire future evaporate in real time. Ilara Vance stood with the fluid grace of someone who'd shed an unbearable weight. The careful mask of confusion she'd worn all evening had vanished, replaced by the commanding presence of a woman who'd built a technological empire through sheer brilliance and unbreakable will. Her English, when it came now, was accented but precise, each word chosen with the accuracy of a surgeon's scalpel. "You see, gentlemen," she continued, her voice carrying across the room with quiet authority, "traumatic brain injury affects everyone differently. In my case, stress causes what doctors call selective aphasia. Under pressure, my brain defaults to its first language, but comprehension." She smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "Comprehension remains perfectly intact." David Chen was looking at his employer with something approaching awe. He'd known her for 15 years, had watched her navigate countless negotiations, but even he hadn't fully grasped the elaborate performance she'd orchestrated tonight. "The recording device," Ilara explained, noting their stares, "has been running since we arrived. Everything you've said, every whispered conspiracy, every moment you thought I was too impaired to understand, it's all documented. My legal team will have transcripts within the hour." Richard found his voice, though it came out as a strangled croak. You can't." "This was a private dinner. Recording without consent is illegal in New York." Ilara's smile widened slightly. "Is it? I believe you'll find that single-party consent is perfectly legal in this state, Mr. Sterling. And as the subject of your conversation about committing fraud against me, I was certainly a party to it." Marcus was shaking his head frantically as if he could somehow negate reality through sheer denial. This is insane. We were trying to help you, to simplify things, by stealing $50 million from the R&D valuation. Ilara's voice cut through his protests like a blade through tissue paper. By inserting non-compete clauses that would prevent me from working in my own field. By planning to absorb my executive team into your structure without my knowledge. She quoted their exact words back at them with devastating precision. From her position by the service door, Chloe watched the scene unfold with a mixture of fascination and justice-drunk satisfaction. She'd spent the entire evening witnessing casual cruelty and systematic exploitation. And now she was seeing cosmic balance restored with the force of a tsunami. But her moment of vindication was interrupted by a commotion at the room's entrance. The maitre d' Henri Dubois swept into the private dining room with the officious fury of a man whose perfectly ordered world had been disrupted. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his French accent thick with indignation. "I have been receiving complaints about disruptions, about recordings being made in my restaurant." His eyes landed on Chloe and his expression shifted from general anger to targeted rage. "And you," he hissed, pointing a manicured finger at her. "I received word that you've been participating in private conversations, sitting at tables with guests." Chloe's stomach dropped like a stone thrown into deep water. She'd been so caught up in the drama of the evening that she'd forgotten her own precarious position. She was just the waitress, the invisible servant who dared to make herself visible. "Mr. Dubois," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Silence! You are terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Your behavior tonight has been a disgrace to this establishment." But before Chloe could respond, before the full weight of her professional destruction could settle on her shoulders, Ilara Vance's voice cut through the room like a bell. "Excusez-moi, Monsieur Dubois," she said, her French flawless and formal. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." The maitre d' turned toward her, his anger shifting to confusion as he processed the fact that the supposedly non-English-speaking guest was now addressing him in his native language. "This young woman," Ilara continued in French so rapid and idiomatic that Chloe struggled to follow it all, "has provided invaluable service this evening. She prevented a significant legal and ethical violation from occurring in your establishment. I would suggest that rather than terminating her, you should be considering a commendation." Dubois blinked rapidly, trying to recalibrate his understanding of the situation. "Madam, I was told that she had disrupted your dinner, that she saved it," Ilara said, simply switching back to English. "And by extension, she may have saved this restaurant from becoming complicit in corporate fraud." The word fraud hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Dubois's face went pale as he began to understand the potential liability his establishment might have faced if the evening had proceeded as Richard and Marcus had planned. Richard Sterling chose that moment to make his last, desperate play. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the Persian rug with an ugly sound. "This is all very dramatic, but let's not forget the basic facts here. We came here in good faith to negotiate a legitimate business transaction. If you want to walk away, that's your prerogative, but these accusations are completely unfounded." His voice carried the practiced authority of a man accustomed to talking his way out of consequences, but there was a desperate edge to it that hadn't been there earlier. Ilara regarded him with the kind of cold assessment usually reserved for specimens in a laboratory. "Mr. Sterling, I've been recording business meetings for 20 years. It's a habit I developed after too many men like you claimed to have said things they never said or denied saying things they absolutely did." She gestured to David Chen, who withdrew a tablet from his briefcase and began typing rapidly. "My assistant is currently uploading tonight's recording to a secure server with copies being sent to my legal team, the SEC's Enforcement Division, and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Unit." Marcus made a choking sound as if the air had suddenly become too thin to breathe. "You see," Ilara continued, Attempting to defraud someone you believe to be cognitively impaired isn't just morally reprehensible. It's a federal crime, elder abuse specifically with a sentence enhancement for the dollar amount involved. The room had become a tableau of destruction. Two of the most powerful men in corporate America sat exposed and ruined their careers, imploding in real time. The maitre d' stood frozen between deference and damage control. And Chloe, the invisible waitress who'd somehow become the catalyst for this avalanche of consequences, remained transfixed by the sheer scope of what was unfolding. Elara Vance moved toward the door with the serene confidence of someone who'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. But before leaving, she turned back to address the room one final time. "Gentlemen, you made one crucial error tonight. You assumed that vulnerability equals stupidity and that silence equals consent. Those assumptions have cost you everything." The door closed behind her with the soft finality of a coffin lid, leaving chaos and ruin in her wake. 3 months later, Chloe Martinez stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of a corner office on the 42nd floor of the Vance Tower in Midtown Manhattan. The city sprawled below her like a living circuit board, its lights pulsing with the rhythm of 8 million dreams and ambitions. The same streets where she'd once hurried between classes and work shifts now looked different from this elevation. Not smaller, but more comprehensible, as if height had granted her the perspective to see patterns she'd missed from ground level. The transformation had begun that very night in Aurelia's private dining room. As Henri Dubois had stood stammering apologies and Elara Vance had walked out into the New York darkness, Chloe had found herself caught between worlds. No longer invisible, but not yet sure what she'd become. The conversation that changed everything had happened in Elara's Rolls-Royce parked outside the restaurant, as police cars arrived to take statements about what the media would later call the Aurelia fraud. Sitting in leather seats that cost more than her annual tuition, Chloe had listened to a proposition that seemed too extraordinary to be real. "I need someone I can trust." Elara had said, her English still careful but growing stronger with each word. "Someone who sees what others miss, who hears what isn't being said. Tonight you were the only person in that room who understood what was really happening." The offer had been overwhelming in its scope, a position as Elara's personal cultural liaison and executive assistant, a full scholarship to complete her art history degree, and a salary that would transform not just her life, but her family's future. More than that, it was an invitation into a world where her skills, her ability to read people, to understand languages, to remain observant while appearing invisible, were not just valued but essential. The legal aftermath had been swift and devastating for Richard Sterling and Marcus Thorne. The FBI's white-collar crime division had found their recorded conspiracy to be just the tip of an iceberg of fraudulent practices spanning years. Sterling Innovations had collapsed within weeks, its stock price falling to penny levels, as investigators uncovered a pattern of predatory acquisitions targeting vulnerable companies and their founders. Marcus Thorne had attempted to plea bargain, offering information about other schemes in exchange for leniency. Richard Sterling had maintained his innocence even as federal prosecutors presented recordings of his own voice, planning to commit fraud against a woman he believed to be cognitively impaired. The trial had been a media sensation, with legal experts calling it a landmark case in corporate elder abuse. The recorded dinner conversation had been played in its entirety during testimony, Richard and Marcus's whispered conspiracy echoing through a federal courtroom while cameras rolled. The contrast between their private contempt and public concern had been devastating. Both men had received federal prison sentences. 7 years for Sterling, 5 for Thorne, with additional civil penalties that would strip them of their remaining assets. The companies they'd built through questionable acquisitions were being dismantled by court-appointed administrators, their victims finally receiving compensation for decades of exploitation. But the story had resonated beyond the business world. Chloe's role in exposing the fraud had made her an unlikely symbol, the invisible service worker who'd refused to remain silent while witnessing injustice. Speaking requests flooded in from universities, cultural organizations, and advocacy groups. Her first public speech had been at NYU's graduation ceremony, where she'd been awarded an honorary degree alongside her earned Bachelor of Arts in Art History. Standing at the podium before thousands of graduates and their families, she'd spoken about the power of bearing witness, of choosing courage over comfort. "We are all invisible to someone," she'd said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. "The question is not whether we'll be overlooked, but what we'll do when we see others being dismissed, diminished, or exploited." Silence in the face of injustice isn't neutrality. It's complicity. The speech had gone viral, shared millions of times across social media platforms with hashtags like Invisible No More and Witness Justice. But for Chloe, the real impact wasn't in the digital metrics. It was in the emails and letters from service workers, from immigrants, from anyone who'd ever felt unseen or unheard. Now as Director of Cultural Affairs for the Vance Foundation, Chloe oversaw grants and programs supporting underrepresented artists and entrepreneurs globally. Her linguistic abilities, once just a personal asset, had become professional superpowers as she helped facilitate partnerships between innovators across language and cultural barriers. The Foundation's flagship program, Voices Unheard, provided funding and mentorship to artists and technologists from marginalized communities. In its first year, it had supported over 200 projects across 6 continents, from a solar energy collective in rural Kenya to a virtual reality therapy program developed by formerly incarcerated artists in Detroit. Ilara Vance herself had made a remarkable recovery. The stress-induced aphasia that had made English inaccessible during high-pressure situations had gradually improved through therapy and time. She'd returned to active leadership of her technology companies, though with new policies requiring recorded meetings and mandatory cultural competency training for all executives. More importantly, she'd become a powerful advocate for disability rights in corporate settings. Her congressional testimony about ableism in business negotiations had led to new federal guidelines for accommodating cognitive disabilities in high-stakes transactions. The assumption that different means deficient, she'd told a Senate subcommittee, cost those men their freedom and their fortunes. But more importantly, it nearly cost me my life's work. We cannot allow corporate predators to target vulnerable people simply because they communicate differently or need accommodations. The relationship between Chloe and Ilara had evolved far beyond employer and employee. They'd become something rarer in the business world. Genuine partners united by shared values and complementary skills. Ilara's technical brilliance and strategic mind paired seamlessly with Chloe's cultural fluency and intuitive understanding of human nature. Their collaboration had produced innovations in cross-cultural business practices that were being studied at business schools worldwide. The Vance Protocol, a framework for conducting international negotiations with cultural sensitivity and ethical transparency, was being adopted by Fortune 500 companies seeking to avoid the kind of spectacular failures that had destroyed sterling innovations. But perhaps the most profound change had been personal. Chloe's family, once worried about her precarious financial situation and uncertain future, had watched their daughter transform from a struggling student into a globally recognized advocate for social justice. Her younger brother, inspired by her example, had applied for and received a Vance Foundation scholarship to study international relations. Her mother, a hotel housekeeper who'd spent decades invisible to the wealthy guests she served, had been invited to speak at a foundation gala about the dignity of service work. "You didn't just change your life," her mother had said at that gala, her voice thick with emotion. "You changed how the world sees people like us." The anniversary of the Aurelia dinner had passed quietly, marked not with celebration but with reflection. Chloe had returned to the restaurant, now under new management after Henri Dubois had resigned in disgrace, and sat in the same private dining room where everything had changed. The space looked different now, somehow smaller and less imposing. The mahogany walls and crystal chandelier that had once seemed so intimidating were revealed as mere decoration, beautiful but powerless to hide the human dramas that played out beneath them. She'd brought with her a letter that had arrived that morning from a server at a restaurant in Los Angeles. The young woman had written about witnessing her own version of the Aurelia incident, customers treating staff poorly while discussing business that affected thousands of jobs. Inspired by Chloe's example, she documented the conversation and reported it to relevant authorities. "I used to think speaking up wasn't my place," the letter read. "But you showed me that sometimes the people who aren't supposed to have a voice are exactly the ones who need to use it." Sitting in that dining room surrounded by ghosts of greed and redemption, Chloe had reflected on the strange alchemy that could transform invisibility into influence. Influence silence into testimony and observation into action. She thought about Richard Sterling and Marcus Thorne, who were now serving their federal sentences in minimum security prisons. Their falls from grace had been complete and public, their names forever associated with corporate predation and criminal arrogance. But she also thought about the hundreds of people who'd reached out to share their own stories of being overlooked, underestimated, or exploited. Teachers who'd exposed administrative corruption, healthcare workers who'd reported patient abuse, retail employees who'd documented wage theft, all of them finding their voices because someone had shown them that invisibility could be a strength rather than a weakness. The Vance Foundation's latest initiative was a documentary film project called The Watchers, featuring stories of service workers, immigrants, and other invisible community members who'd witnessed and reported injustice. Chloe was serving as executive producer, using her platform to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. The film's trailer had already garnered international attention, with early screenings scheduled at Cannes and Sundance. But more importantly, it was sparking conversations in communities worldwide about the moral obligation to speak truth to power. Standing in her corner office as evening fell over Manhattan, Chloe received a text from Alara. "Board meeting tomorrow at 9. We're approving the new scholarship program for service industry workers. Your presentation changed everything." She smiled, remembering her own desperation just months earlier, when a single missed shift could have meant the difference between making rent and sleeping on a friend's couch. Now she was in a position to ensure that other young people wouldn't have to choose between economic survival and moral courage. The city lights were beginning to twinkle below, each one representing lives and dreams and struggles she understood intimately. Somewhere down there, in restaurants and hotels and office buildings across the metropolis, people were working invisible jobs, seeing everything, hearing everything, mattering more than anyone realized. The phone on her desk rang, the secure line reserved for the most sensitive foundation business. Chloe recognized the number. It was from a tech company in Singapore, where their cultural liaison had identified what appeared to be systematic discrimination against older employees. "Chloe Martinez." She answered, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd learned that visibility was not a gift to be granted by others, but a power to be claimed by oneself. "Ms. Martinez," came the voice from halfway around the world. "We have a situation that requires your expertise. Are you available for an emergency consultation?" She looked out at the city one more time, at all those lights representing all those lives, and felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had first moved her to action in that dining room. "I'm on my way," she said. The story was far from over. In conference rooms, in restaurants, in boardrooms, in break rooms, in every space where power and vulnerability intersected, there were still voices waiting to be heard, still injustices waiting to be exposed, still watchers waiting to become witnesses. And Chloe Martinez, once invisible, now unstoppable, was ready to help them find their voice. The woman who'd started as a waitress had become something far more powerful. A guardian of the unseen, a translator not just of languages, but of truth itself. In a world that often preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable realities, she'd chosen to be the one who refused to look away. The lights of the city pulsed below like a heartbeat, and somewhere in that rhythm was the promise that justice, while it might come slowly, would always find a way to be heard, even if it had to whisper its way into the world through the voice of someone everyone thought didn't matter.